ערב טוב לכולם.
Hello.
אנחנו מזמינים... Hello. We are very happy to welcome here Hope Edelman, and soon I will present you. כן, נשמח לבקש לפתוח מצלמות מי שיכול. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Shaiko Brandwine, and I am a part of the organizing team of the Civil Bereavement Awareness Week. We all know people who have had a family member die prematurely. Civilian Bereavement Awareness Week aims to create a community language and social means to support these people and families. This is a step up in the mutual guarantee of the Israeli society, an attempt to move forward in creating infrastructure to embrace the families to private bereavement. Thank you to the Israeli Rabbinate, the Hartman Institute, and the Midrasha Be'oranim, who lead the project this year, and in particular to Orit Raz, who leads the team. And also to the Ykir and Pini Rabinovich associations, who have been leading the issue for 25 years. And to all the speakers who put their particular effort for this important issue. This evening, I am honored to welcome Hope Edelman. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hope Edelman has been writing, lecturing, and leading workshops in the field of bereavement for more than 25 years. Hope's first book, Motherless Daughters, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and appeared on bestseller lists around the world. She published 6 other books, including the book Motherless Mothers. The work has been translated into 14 languages and published in 11 countries. The books Motherless Mothers and Motherless Daughters were translated to Hebrew. Hope has published articles in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and more. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and a master's degree in nonfiction writing from the University of Iowa. She's a life coach and has a certificate in narrative therapy. I thank you very much for joining this week and wish a fascinating lecture for all our guests.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I will be doing this talk in English because my Hebrew is fairly limited, but it's very, very nice to see all of you here, and I'm grateful to be able to present to you. I'm wondering, can you make me a co-host so I can share my screen, because I was told I could use slides, and it might be nicer for you to be able to see some graphics.
Of course. Is it done? Yes.
Done. I can share a screen. So hello, everybody. I'm Hope Edelman. I'm the author of the books Motherless Daughters, Motherless Mothers, Letters from Motherless Daughters, and my most recent book is called The After Grief, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss. I'm also the founder and the CEO at motherlessdaughters.com, where we offer programming both online and in person, right now just in the US, but we're poised for expansion in person, but our virtual services reach women all over the world, including in Israel. We do support group calls, we do support groups online, we do retreats, we do coaching circles, and many good things coming up next year as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to switch over to a slideshow because I thought I'd talk to you for a while about early mother loss. And when I say early, I mean like through your 20s. I work mostly with women, female identified individuals who were children, teenagers, and young adults when their mothers died. So I don't really talk or work that much with women whose relationships with their mothers are estranged if the mother is still living. I'm looking at mothers who died, and it was a very silent population for a long time in the United States and in many other countries as well. I'll get to that in a moment, but I'm going to switch over to the screen, and then hopefully there'll be time for some discussion At the end, I tried to work that in. We're going 1 hour. Is that correct? It's 1 full hour. Okay, great. All right, let's share screen. And we'll put it on a slideshow. Great. Okay. The topic today is motherless daughters, understanding ourselves as women, partners, and mothers, because the early loss of a mother does reverberate and have ripple effects into so many areas of our lives. I thought I'd start with a picture of my family. This is my family. That's my mother, Marcia, in the middle, my father, Julian, in the back. I'm the one rocking the silver aviator glasses there. My younger sister, Michelle, is in front of me, and that's my brother, Glenn. I'm going to guess that I was 14 in this picture. That was 1978. That was about 2 years, maybe 1.5 years or 2 years before my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, very advanced breast cancer. That took her life 1.5 years later when I was 17. This picture is emblematic of my family in so many ways because my mother really was the center or the anchor of the family. And after she died, it was hard to feel that sense of family cohesion again. And I came from a family that was very typical for 1981 when there were no grief support services, which meant that we didn't talk about my mom. We didn't talk about her death, which I guess was understandable because the end of it was so sorrowful and so traumatic, really. But we also didn't talk about her life. And that was really confusing for the children. I came to understand many years later that this was very, very common in families that had suffered such a profound and foundational loss. But as I wrote in a later book, we had experienced a cataclysmic subtraction and nobody would talk about it. And so I went looking for a book that would explain what I was going through because I didn't know any other girls beside my sister and one other family in our neighborhood that had 2 daughters and a son, but I wasn't friendly with them. I was looking to try to understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling and what it might mean to the rest of my life to have lost my mom at such a young age. And there were no books in the 1980s. There were books for women who were adults when their moms died because that was so much more common. But I felt like my experience had been erased also. And I knew there must be other girls out there like me. I just didn't know how to find them. So I looked for that book throughout my teenage years. I looked for that book when I was in college. I looked for that book when I was in my first job. And eventually I ended up in graduate school in a writing program. And I was honestly just so fed up, I decided to write the book myself. And that's the book, Motherless Daughters. That was published in 1994. It's now out in, I think, 16 countries. I just signed a licensing agreement with China. Israel was one of the first countries to sign on. So you can find the book, I believe, in Israel. I'm pretty sure the title is Banot Lelo Imahot, and it is in Hebrew, but you can get a copy in English as well. This is the 20th anniversary edition. We're now coming up on the 30th anniversary edition, and by now there are over 1 million copies of the book that have been sold. In the US, it is considered the go-to book when someone's mom dies. Someone will often gift them this book. And women say it helps them feel less alone because it describes what they've gone through. But this book, in so many ways, women write to me and say, this book saved my life. That's the phrase that they use. And in many ways, this book saved my life because I didn't know other women who'd lost mothers. And when I started interviewing women for the book, there were so many who appeared and wanted to talk with me. And I would sit and their stories would just come pouring out. And I interviewed, I believe, 92 women for the first edition of Motherless Daughters. That's a lot of women. And I could see patterns emerging in the interviews, no matter how old they were when their moms died, no matter how old they were now, no matter how their moms died, no matter their race, their religion, their geography. After a certain point, when we got through the details, they started telling the same story over and over. And common themes began to emerge. And here are some of the ones that I saw. A lot of women said, and they used this language, my mother was the glue that held the family together. And they felt like after she had died, the family didn't have that sense of closeness or cohesion that I mentioned earlier. So many women said we stopped talking about her after she died, like an epidemic. I hear that all the time. And that silence can be so damaging and so corrosive to family members. It's critically important to share our stories of mother loss and express our feelings. And this is all the programming that I do now, is to give women a space online or in person to do that with each other. A lot said I had to grow up too fast. They had to take on responsibility for themselves or for younger siblings, or emotionally had to become their own support at a very young age. And it made them out of sync with their friends and their peers. And so many of them said, no one ever gave me as a child permission to grieve. This is kind of a loaded statement. We can unpack this and spend about half an hour just on this sentence. Number one, because children grieve so differently than adults. Number two, because people tend to have a cultural expectation of what grief should look like, and it doesn't look that way for everyone. But many of them said, I didn't have a safe place to talk or express my feelings. I needed the adults around me to take care of me at this time. And many of them said these adults did not step up, often because they didn't know how, not because they didn't want to or didn't care, because they didn't know how, or they didn't understand how children grieve, and they didn't know what to look for, and they didn't know how to support them. There were no children's bereavement centers or grief programs in the 1980s in the US, not in the 1990s. Really, they didn't start taking off until the 2000s. And many of the adult women I work with lost their mothers before then. I mentioned that women grieve differently. I just want to take a moment to talk about how daughters grieve. In 1981, when my mom died, a social worker gave me a handout, a pamphlet that said the 5 stages of grief. And it outlined denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These were based on the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And this is how, back in the 70s, the 80s, even into the 90s, popular culture and many therapists thought grief should look. And it was such a bad model for grief, because that's not how grief works. It's not even how Elizabeth Kubler-Ross thought grief works. She developed those stages with patients who were nearing the end of their own lives. She was interviewing terminally ill patients and saw that they went through these 5 stages, and then they got transferred onto the survivors, the family members, the people who had loved these individuals after they died, and it never was a good fit, and she knew it, but culture grabbed it and ran with it because it seemed like, oh, this is an easy way, an easy pathway out of grief. It was so appealing and so seductive. Daughters who've lost mothers know that it doesn't work that way. Grief goes in cycles. It comes around, it ebbs and it flows. We go through an acute phase that's very, very painful, where maybe we feel like we don't know how we're going to get through this. This is true for any kind of loss, by the way, for men and women who lose anyone or any big transition in their life. And once you get through that acute phase, or that really fresh part of grief, and you create a new normal, you find that it comes back in waves, often at unexpected time. And for daughters who lose mothers, there are certain transitional events that can cause a grief reaction, even many years after a loss. This is something we didn't understand back when my mom died, but graduations, weddings, childbirth, illnesses, divorce, all of these can cause what we call a grief spike that comes back and kind of blindsides us because we might not have been expecting it. Just want to take a few minutes to go over some data with you, because there are now more studies on adults bereaved as children. That's what this group is called. Adults who experience the loss of a parent or sibling when they were young. In 2012, there was a big poll that was sponsored in the US by the National Alliance of Grieving Children. They found, when they talked with the children themselves, that 75% of them surveyed said the emotion they currently feel is sadness. feeling angry, alone, overwhelmed, and worried also topping the list. 39% said they have trouble sleeping. 47% said their lives would be harder than other people's. 73% said they think about their loved one every day. 71% said you never stop missing the people you love who die. 68% said the death of their family member was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. The Harvard Child Bereavement Study looked at children who lost parents. This is still considered a gold standard for children's bereavement. This study found mother loss is harder on children than father loss is because it results in more daily life changes for a child. In most families, the death of a mother means the loss of the emotional caretaker. So even when there's a big change in family finances, as there often is after a father dies, it seems that in most families, mothers are able to keep the kids' routines pretty constant and still be there for them emotionally. But when a mother dies, there are more daily life changes, changes in routine, changes in emotional support. Children whose mothers died in this study compared to fathers were more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems, such as anxiety, acting out, lower self-esteem, and lower feelings of competence than those who lost their fathers. And also found that children remained more strongly connected emotionally to mothers who have died than to fathers who have died. Now, statistically, in virtually any culture, you will look at children 18 and younger or 21 and younger, and more will have lost fathers than mothers, just because fathers tend to die younger than mothers, or they can have children at more advanced ages. But this is what, even though maybe in their study it was 1/3 who'd lost mothers, 2/3 who'd lost fathers, this is what they found. Maxine Harris wrote a book called The Loss That Is Forever about adults who lose parents. And she says that when a parent dies young, children have a meeting with death that influences the way they see the world for the rest of their lives. There's a saying that once you know something, you can never not know it. And that's true. Once you understand the horror and the mystery of death at a young age, you can't unknow it. And it is a knowledge that most of your peers will not have. So your worldview shifts, your perspective shifts. And if you are at an age where your personality and your brain are still developing, which is believed to be all the way up to age 25, the experience you have around that loss gets folded into the personality. It can actually affect your brain structure as it develops. And we have quite a bit of evidence on that. So if you have lost a parent when you were young and you feel that you are different from other adults around you, you might not be wrong. You may be different in some very concrete physiological ways, in addition to having a worldview or a schema, as it's called in psychology, that is different from most adults you know, but very similar to other adults who have lost parents. I've been doing this work for almost 30 years, and there's so many similarities among this group and so much relief when they find each other and think, oh my God, there are others out there who think like me, who feel like me. I remember when I first started doing this work in New York City, a woman saying, I feel like the alien who found the mothership, because I've felt different from everyone for so long. And I feel like I've finally found the place, where I belong. Early mother loss can affect so many aspects of a daughter's life. It can affect her self-esteem and sense of self-worth. She may feel lonely and different from others. I'm all alone, nobody understands me, is a theme that often comes up. It can affect their relationships, their ability to interact with other people, the way they interact with other people. It can affect their sense of trust. So much depends also on what kind of care they received after a mother died. In fact, all the research points to that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. They may feel isolated from their peers because their worldview is so different. But at the same time, they can feel an incredible sense of competence. They become very resourceful very adaptive, and they can develop a sense of gratitude and appreciation for life and small things. You know, a lot of motherless daughters I meet learn not to sweat the small things because they know that the big things are what's important. So I'm just going to run through a list of 7 things to know about motherless daughters. When I say that, if you are a motherless daughter, you might feel different from other women around you who didn't lose their moms. Here are some of the ways in which you may be different from other women, but very much like other women whose moms died when they were young. The first one is that a daughter's mourning spans a lifetime. This is really important for those around you to understand. Your partners, your extended family, your friends, your therapists even. It's because of that cyclical grief that I talked about earlier, that you will, at certain points in your development, experience the loss of your mom in a new and different way that you couldn't have experienced it before. You couldn't have pre-grieved it. In The After Grief, my most recent book, I call this new old grief. It's when you experience an old loss in a new way. And I'll give you a classic example. My first daughter was born when I was 33. I got pregnant at 32. I gave birth at 33. So this was 16 years after my mother died. Now, at 17 years old, there was absolutely no way that I could have grieved the loss of my mother as a grandmother to my child. I didn't have that, you know, I wasn't coming from that orientation. I believe, and this is what we talk about at Motherless Daughters, that we can grieve only to the extent of our ability at any given point in time. At 17, I could only grieve with the intellectual and emotional capacity of a 17-year-old. The same is true for a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old. But the key to children's bereavement is that a 6-year-old will grieve to the best of a 6-year-old's ability. And that might be not at all if the adults around them aren't there to support them and help them in that process. So when a woman comes to me and says, I never grieved for my mother, we look and we create a grief timeline. How were you reacting or responding? What support did you have? It may not be that you didn't grieve. It may be that shutting down was your coping strategy for grief. And that's a form of grief. But as children develop intellectually, emotionally, they will look back at the death of their mom and have grief responses as they come to a new understanding at different times in their life. And the adults don't know this. They don't know that that 6-year-old, when she becomes 12, may have a complete understanding of what death is and what happened and have a grief response then. They won't link it back to something that happened when this girl was 6. So it's really important to know how children's bereavement works, because that 12-year-old also, when she graduates from high school, may have another grief response that no one's going to connect to her as an event that occurred when she was 6, but is going to be very much related to that. So when I became a mother at 33, even when I was pregnant, I could not grieve the loss of my mom or the absence of my mom as a mother until I became a mother. I just couldn't grieve it till I got there. And those first few weeks after my daughter was born, I was so incredibly sad. I missed my mom so much. I saw the world now through the eyes of a mother. So I could see what my mom had lost. I could understand how much she had loved her children. And I was so sad that she wasn't getting to see her first grandchild, and that this baby in my arms, who's now 25, was never going to meet the grandmother that she was named for. My mother's name was Marcia. My daughter's name is Maya. Her dad's Israeli, so my children have Israeli names. My daughter's name is Maya. And so she would never get to meet my mother. And I couldn't have grieved that at 17. I needed support for that when I was 33. And if I hadn't known that, I'm not sure anyone would have connected that to a loss at 17. I'm now training therapists and coaches to understand all of this so that they can better help their clients. And that so women who lose mothers or who lost mothers in the past can go to therapists who have been trained with these understandings. Okay, let's move on to number 2. Oh, here. There are predictable milestones and life events that will reactivate mourning or are very likely to. If you were younger than menstruation age, when you get your first period, it's a time when girls really miss their moms. Graduations, weddings, getting your first job and wanting to share that with your mom. Pregnancy and birth, especially of the first child, and even more if the first child is a girl. That's a really big deal. Losing a job, times when we want comfort or security. I see some people smiling, so I know there are women out there that understand what I'm saying, and I'm really glad you're here. And I hope you feel seen, because that's something that a lot of us didn't feel for a long time. Empty nesting when your kids move out is experienced often as a form of loss and a change in identity. And divorce are also times that can reactivate mourning for a mom. The big one, and this is the really big one in this community, I would say number 2 is becoming a mother. The really big one is reaching and approaching the mother's age at time of death. We call it crossing the silent threshold, because there have been, until recently, no cultural acknowledgement of this and no rituals for it. So the Motherless Daughters community created rituals that can be personalized for this event. It's a big deal to reach your mom's age, and then when she died, and then pass it and become older than she ever got to be. My mom was 42 when she died. And I'm going to tell you, when I was 17, I was like, 42, that's so old. She went to college, she got married, she had children, she did all of the things that adults are, it seemed so distant to me. But as I approached 42, reached 42, and passed 42, I had a big grief reaction, because it was so shocking how young my mom had been. And I realized, oh, she did not get a full life. She only got half a life. And I'm 16 years older now than my mom got to be, which is, I don't even know how still to wrap my mind around that, to be that much older than my mom, who died younger than most of my younger friends. At some point, I think my oldest daughter is almost I think she's closer to my mom's age at time of death than I am now, which is really, I never thought about that before, but it's really something. So it's a big deal. And we have support services for women who experience this, because it is such a big deal. Okay, number 3, a father's coping skills matter. They matter a lot. Like, they matter really a lot. If your father is a caregiver after your mom dies, how he copes is the number 1 determinant of how a daughter will cope, or a son as well. Same is true when a dad dies. It's that surviving parent. It may not have been if your parents were divorced, or your father predeceased your mom, or your father wasn't around. There may have been another caregiver who took care of you, an aunt, a grandmother. Their coping skills matter a lot too. But if you are raised by a father after a mother dies, his ability to cope, his ability to handle his own emotions matters a great deal. I work with a lot of women, I would say the majority, whose fathers cope with the loss of their wife by dating and remarrying very quickly. And then there's a new woman in the house, and that brings a whole host of other issues that a daughter will need to adjust to. But it's the number 1 factor, and all the research supports this, how much a dad's coping skills matter. Number 4 is that an early loss, which is called an imprinting loss, will affect the ability to cope with later loss. How your family handles that loss becomes the template for how loss will affect you later on, how your nervous system, how your body will respond to loss. Later losses are determined by how your early loss is handled. That can, of course, be changed. But it often requires some kind of outside support, whether it's therapy or support groups, or talking with other people, or reading, or making, putting intention into learning how to cope with loss in a different way, perhaps, than your family did in the past. It's also really important, especially if any of you are therapists out there, to remember that mother loss may be only one of several adverse experiences in an individual's childhood, meaning There may have been a climate of hardship already in a family when a mother dies, or a mother's death can create a ripple effect where there are then other hardships that a child must cope with. This is particularly true in a family where a mother dies by suicide, because there may have been mental illness or addiction or other issues that a child was having to manage or live with before that loss. Also, if a mother was sick for a long time and really struggling, those are adversities as well. Adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs study that took place in the 1990s revealed that multiple adversities, and that would include the death of a mother, but not be limited to it, really do affect childhood and adult health and brain development. And again, we could talk a whole half hour or more just about this, but it is important to recognize that mother loss may not be the only factor that has affected a daughter's well-being over time. What happens after, and that includes her father's response or her caregiver's response, what happens after a mother dies can have as much effect on a daughter's long-term adjustment as the death or the absence of the mother itself. Early mother loss is a form of childhood trauma, and it can create an attachment wound that affects the ability to securely attach to others. And again, this depends so much on whether the child had a consistent, warm, loving caregiver to attach to after a mother died. The girls that did have that tend to be able to form secure bonds in adulthood. Those who didn't tend to follow what we call anxious attachment patterns or disorganized attachment patterns or avoidant attachment patterns. And that can show up in their one-to-one relationships with their partners, with their coworkers, with their children. It's widely believed that our ability to attach to others, or the way we attach to others, is determined by our first handful of years, maybe the first 3 years of life. But losing a mother, if you were securely attached to her and then not being surrounded by loving, consistent caregivers, can disrupt that secure attachment. I work with a lot of women who would fall into what we call the disorganized attachment category, which is a strong desire to have a loving relationship, close, intimate relationships, but also tend to push those close to them away because they're afraid of being disappointed or being left. It's the "I'll leave you before you can leave me" pattern of attachment. And again, all of this can be worked on, but these are some things to know about motherless daughters. And these are gross generalizations. You're not going to, this isn't going to speak, every one of these may not speak to you if you have lost a mom when you were young. It may not speak to all of your clients if you're a therapist, but they are some generalizations that do show up over and over again. Also, motherless daughters have very specific and very unique fears and goals. Many of them are hypervigilant about their health. If their mom died to an illness, they're afraid of dying young. They're afraid of dying at the same age of their mom, of the same cause. Their goals may be different from their peers. A lot of them are very focused on being there to get their children into adulthood, for example, which is not something that women who have mothers tend to focus on. They may have very specific life goals that are related to having lost a mom. Many want to accomplish a lot by a young age in case they too have a foreshortened life. I also wanted to talk a little bit about motherless mothers because I wrote a whole book on this. And losing a mom when you're young does affect the way you raise your children. It can, but I'm going out on a limb here. I'm going to say it does for almost every woman that I interviewed for that book and who I've met since. And in my personal experience, I have 2 daughters. They are now 25 and 21. And of course, the way that I raised them was influenced by my mother's life and my first 17 years with her, but also by all the years afterward that I didn't have her. I was missing some of the things that my friends had in terms of practical, instrumental support. I had no family to help me raise my daughters, no one to leave them with for a weekend, except on very rare occasion. And no one really that I trusted to turn to for advice. I didn't have anyone to tell me what I had been like as a child. I didn't have what just felt like an emotional safety net, you know, that one person I could call and cry and say, oh my God, this is so hard. It's just so hard. How did you do it? And have someone say, yeah, it's hard, but it's also an incredible blessing. You'll get through it. So here are 6 themes of motherless mothers, and then I hope we'll have some time for discussion or questions if anyone would like to participate. Women who lose mothers when they're young often have a strong desire to reactivate the mother-child relationship, even if it means re-entering the relationship from the other side. I'm going to say that the big secret these women have is that the majority of them prefer daughters, want their first child to be a daughter so they can have the mother-daughter relationship back, only to discover that the mother-child relationship gives them a lot of what they need, and they love their sons to pieces. So they're fine when they have boys. It's just they're envisioning recreating the mother-daughter relationship. But none of them, not one woman that I spoke with for motherless mothers or since, has said that they regretted that their first child was a boy once they met that baby. There is a proportion, though, of women who are afraid to have a child without their moms. They don't want to do it without the support of their mom. They don't feel that they have what they will need if their mother isn't there, especially if they were very young when their mom died, and they feel that they didn't get the kind of mothering that they would need in order to be a mother, that they have to have gotten it in order to give it, which is not always true. When I work with women who say, I'm not sure I want to have a child, I'm afraid I don't think I can do it without my mom, I tell them there are lots of good reasons to not have a child. Like, for example, you don't like babies, or you don't feel that you'll have the patience to have a child, or you don't want your life to change in a big way. But if your reason for not having a child is because you're afraid you won't know how to do it without your mom, I encourage you to look at options that might support you, that there are many resources that you can tap into. And also, I say, you're imagining how you would cope if the baby were here tomorrow. If you're not even pregnant yet, you probably got a good solid year or more to figure this out and get things in place and find support, and we'll help you do that. So that fear of having a child because you don't feel like you have the confidence or the ability is certainly something that can be worked on. But again, there are good reasons to not have children, and I would never try to get in the way of that as a coach. Number 2, here it is, a concern about not knowing how to be a mother, particularly raising a child beyond the age they were when their mom died. I will tell you honestly, both of my children are older than 17 now, and I'm completely flying blind. Like, I didn't have a mom. So I don't know what an adult mother-child relationship feels like from the child's point of view. I only know it from the mother's point of view. And I know that I make some really messy mistakes, but I communicate with my daughters and I say, you know, I didn't have a mom at your age, so I don't really know like what you need from me or what is expected of me, but let's figure this out together and co-create this relationship, because I don't have the experience, you know, to know how to do it all on my own. And my daughters are really generous with that, fortunately. Motherless mothers were 8 times more likely than women without mothers to express they don't know how to be a mother. So interesting. I did a survey of women who'd lost mothers and a survey of women who had mothers, both of whom, you know, had children themselves. And the women who'd lost their moms were 8 times more likely than the other women to say, I sometimes or often feared not knowing how to be a mother. So it's like just having that mother figure there offered a form of confidence and even like protection maybe, or safety that motherless mothers felt they lacked. Number 3, motherless mothers have an intense preoccupation with the possibility that they, their child, or their spouse or partner might suffer an untimely death. It's called death anxiety and perceived vulnerability. in psychological terms. It's just higher in populations of adults who lost parents when they were young. Again, it's that knowledge that bad things can happen at any moment and that we can't prevent them. It's just a higher concern in this population. 51% of motherless mothers said they worry often about dying young, compared to only 15% of women who had mothers. So that's a pretty big difference. Number 4, motherless mothers tend to have a parenting style that others often label as overprotective. I think of it as vigilant or hypervigilant. It involves trying to shield the child from physical or emotional harm. It's, of course, to protect their children, but it's often also to protect them from suffering another devastating trauma or loss. It's not necessarily a bad thing until it crosses over into controlling the child's behavior or the child feels controlled, and then it becomes an issue for parent and child. A bonus theme here. A bonus theme is the belief that having and raising a child has been an unparalleled healing experience, and that it helps to restore or undo the wrongs of the past. Now, women who don't have children sometimes look at this and say, I don't have a child, so am I missing out on this? No, you can get this from being with children, with nieces and nephews, from being a mentor. But the women who give birth and raise children do say that it does help to restore or undo some of the wrongs of the past. So here's a conclusion. Motherless daughters and motherless mothers are a unique population of their own. They face specific emotional and psychological challenges that other women just don't experience. And this is why seeking out the company of other motherless daughters is so very important. Robert Niemeyer, who is a bereavement expert in the United States, who lost his dad when he was young, and who writes a lot about adjusting to loss, says that the bereaved need 3 things in order to heal to the fullest extent. They need support. They need normalization, which means they need to know that others feel and think the same way that they do. And they need validation. You're not crazy. It's okay that you think and feel this way. I know you feel different from other people, but we're going to normalize those thoughts. So motherless daughters need to normalize their experiences and discover they're not alone. It's such an important part of the healing process, that sense of community, because we were not meant to grieve alone. We are social beings. Until the 20th century, the village used to come together to mourn the loss of one of its own. And then, with modernism and individualism, after the mourning rituals end, after everyone goes home from the Shiva, there's this belief that we're supposed to just figure it out on our own and be, hyper and rampant individualism. But in fact, we really need each other to get through some of those hard times, especially what I called those grief spikes, the cyclical grief when it comes up. And this is why Motherless Daughters offers the programs that it does. You can see here, there's women gathering in an in-person retreat. Our graduates of our retreat groups come together, and we've done service trips. That's a group in Machu Picchu. We went to Peru twice. And we have weekly support group calls, group supports, discussions about topics that the group chooses. We have women who join from all over the world. Our Thursday calls occur in the evening, Israeli time. We have women who call in some months from Israel and join us. We have women from Germany and Israel and Chile and Australia and the UK. I mean, it's incredible. The UK, we've got these beautiful young student from Germany, from Berlin, who just joined. We have women in Poland and Spain, and it's an intergenerational, international community of women who join in. And these are the 2 books. These are copies in the US of Motherless Daughters and Motherless Mothers. Those little munchkins on the cover, that's Maya on the right. She's 25, and Eden on the left. She's 21 now. And those are the girls who helped me understand what it meant to be a mom, and also what helped me understand what my mom may have experienced and helped me feel close to her as an adult, even after her death. So it looks like we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. I'm wondering if there are any questions or any discussions that we'd like to have. You can drop it in the chat box. You can raise your hand on the screen. You can use the little hand emoji. I saw some people nodding while I was talking. I'd love to hear some of your stories. Is there anything here that really resonated with you that came up